One of our experience has been that 5 years ago, in our country, there was a law that was focused on preparing and responding to emergencies, but working on reducing the risk of disasters. A law was developed that talked about disaster management, and we were looking for a more holistic, a more integral way than just preparing and responding to disasters. And this space has representation from all of the different levels, taking into account the different types of vulnerability in the different regions, working on advocacy from each place. And each of these local representations worked with local governments, with subnational areas, and were then being able to participate in places where the law was being developed, and then it was taken back to the local areas to be able to get feedback before being presented to Congress. And recently, the law was approved. And this national table for disaster management saw it as an example for the space that the law was about. So while it was difficult work to find alliances, to find partnerships in all of the different areas, first it was a fight to become invited, to be invited to different areas, and then to be accepted, and now it's seen as a right. So that, in order to achieve that, it meant coming from local areas, getting a voice in those areas, and then working at a subnational level and then national level. So it was a fight up. And this is being taken as a way of working in all of Central America. It's an example to be taken. And we learned a lot from this process, what works and what doesn't.
Thank you very much. I think that gives a great example of what I was going to suggest next, and which is the challenge we face. It's how do we create networks that links across all of these. And what I heard from the translation, you were able to move from the local up to the national and international. You started with people's own spaces and you demanded invitation into the invited space. You made things more transparent. And you were also empowering people to speak for themselves in that process. So the challenge, if I can, just a second, the challenge is then, how do our strategies connect across these spaces? Right? The closed, the invited, the claimed. How do we connect across the levels? And how do we deal with the visible and the more invisible awareness-building forms of power at the same time? Where are the entry points for change for you? Are you trying to strengthen formal institutions of governments, or are you trying to strengthen people's own local movements? That's the spaces dimension. Are you starting at the local level, or are you dealing with the national or the global, or all three? And what form are you focusing on awareness building, or are you focusing on policy advocacy in the visible space? No group can do all of these at one time. So the question is, how do you build alliances with others to do this collectively? Okay, that's the challenge. And what I wanted to ask you to do, in some separate tables, because it's so complex, we don't have much time, is maybe one set of tables, think about the forms of power and how do you link across them. How do you deal with awareness building on the one hand and the policy work in the visible space on the other. Another set of tables develop this conversation about how do you work across levels, local to global. And another saying, how do you link these people's spaces with the invited spaces, with the closed spaces in our work. Right? So that we can think about a network that's able to cut across all these forms of power simultaneously. Is that okay? Are you willing to talk about that for a few minutes first, or you want some clarification before we do that? Is it clarification, or is it...
Yeah, I just have a question about this model.
Okay.
So just a quick question about this model. I'm just trying to understand this one section, which is Can the power be invisible but at the same time in the claimed space?
Yes.
And can you give us some examples of that?
This is why this is so important. We can romanticize people's own spaces as being those virtuous spaces, and everybody gets to participate. But power exists within that. How many women get to speak in the same way in the traditional authority space? It may be your own indigenous space, but there's still relations of invisible and visible power there. Within a social movement, it may be a created space, but who has power within that? So this model is suggesting in any place we have to look at the forms of power that are going on inside it. It's not to say that there's these virtuous grassroots spaces and these nasty global spaces. There's different forms of power in each, and it's also saying that change happens when it can happen this way. You can have a social movement that puts pressures on the global authorities in order to create a national level invited space. Right? So this is what we have with global authority. It's people don't act in their own community only. They can go around it and penetrate from different directions. Okay, please.
Just as an additional point of clarification, I hesitate to suggest the tables think about another dimension for fear of brain hemorrhage. But time is very, very important as well, and I'm sure you have more elaborate models, and it's very important in this domain, John. The compañera from Honduras spoke earlier, and thinking about Central America, it was after Hurricane Mitch in 1998 that civil society in Central America was able to demand a place in the discussions eventually in Stockholm that developed a whole concept of recovery as transformation. Now we have Haiti. How are these spaces and forms of power shifting at this moment and through this period of early recovery? So that's all I want to throw into the pot or onto the tables is the additional time dimension.
Absolutely. You can't create these things overnight. So where's the starting point? Where's, in your context, what some groups are using this tool for in their own movement, in their own community, in their own national level, saying, well, we may be pretty strong in our work on awareness building, but we're actually not doing very much on the advocacy side, invisible power. You can be a thermometer to check where your entry point is and where you have to build. And then I've done it with groups where I said, what were you doing 10 years ago? A lot of NGOs said, well, we're actually about grassroots empowerment at the building awareness. And I said, where are you spending your time now? That's where they started, but now they're all spending their time up here in these national invited spaces. They never go to the grassroots, right? So they change their colors over time. So let's spend a little time deepening this. One more question, I apologize. And then I'm getting the signals. We have to go on to the small group.
I think it's worth noting that sometimes the loci of power, like the supranational level, some would say are not visible in Copenhagen. They're actually Exxon or Monsanto or Shell. In the national level, they might be the monocultivators that own each of our countries, so they're also non-governmental places of power.
Absolutely. And that it may be that there were forms of power that actually were keeping the real issues off the table in Copenhagen because the debate was being structured. What was real science, what was not? Who was funding those campaigns that structured what was allowed on the table in Copenhagen? That's where you look at these big other forces of power into science and so on. Now I know this is complicated, it's a lot. In your packs you have a very nice version that Oxfam put together in English and in Spanish, which simplifies this approach to power analysis. And soon we're going to have this resource in several languages on our website. But for now, let's just deepen it a little bit. So can I ask these three tables here to focus on this problem? How do you